and Caregiving. Oh, thank you so much, Jennifer. So this session, I have to say, is a little bit new, and I want to thank Jennifer for her willingness to present it as a part of our Essentials of Caregiving sessions. I came up to her, I think it was early this winter, and I said, Jennifer, I really want to talk about this. I think it's so important. We're doing these interviews with caregivers, and this keeps coming up. We're building another education program that includes some of this content. And so thank you so much, Jennifer, for always being so accommodating. So as I mentioned, some of the content that I'm going to be discussing today is a part of a program that is just released as of all of 3 weeks ago called the Confidence Financial Education Program. And this is a program that I've developed with the University of Southern California Leonard Davis School of Gerontology, as well as their LA Caregiver Resource Center, and of course the UT Health San Antonio School of Nursing caring for the Caregiver Program. We are opening registration, or registration is open, I should say, for this program. You may participate in it as a part of a research study, or just if you want to join the program. So no requirement to participate in the study. All right, with no further ado, this is what I'd like to talk with you about today. So our first goal is to define the different challenges that come up when balancing employment and caregiving. And I feel a bit sheepish saying that, since I know many of you could tell me about that and write a whole book on it, but we'll cover that briefly just so we kind of define the challenge that we're talking about. Next, what I want to do is talk about different policies and practices that are available to support family caregivers. And I want to do this for a couple of reasons. One is we know that the policies are patchwork. They're not doing everything that we know that they should be doing right now. So I want you to be aware of what's available and what might you need to consider talking to your organization about. Consider talking to your policymakers at the state level or the federal level about, if you so choose. The other piece of it is there's a lot of stuff that is available that sometimes family members don't always consider for themselves. I think sometimes when we talk about job protections, we think about, oh, that's for somebody else. That's not for someone like me. And I want you to know, yes, these protections are here for you too. And then next we'll talk about how you might approach decisions when it's appropriate to exit the workforce. We know sometimes it can be challenging to balance employment and caregiving, and exiting the workforce is something that families often have to consider either temporarily or even in early retirement. So how do you make those really challenging decisions that we know are not only financial, but also very personal in nature? And lastly, if we have time, what I'd like to do is talk about what kinds of transferable skills you may have learned from caregiving that you might stick on a resume. How has caregiving provided you with these excellent soft skills that you can bring into a different domain, such as the workplace? So with no further ado, I think it's kind of interesting to remember that more than 50%, so nearly 60% of family members are, family caregivers are employed. And I think sometimes that's a surprising figure, since when you think about if you talk to one caregiver, they might feel very isolated in facing this challenge. Oh my gosh, how do I do it? And yet so many people are doing it. We have like almost, 18 million family caregivers to older adults in the United States. And yet we all are facing these challenges very individually. So how can we think about these as a social problem that we need to address collectively? How you better balance employment and caregiving. I want to share a couple of excerpts from some interviews that we did recently with family caregivers, particularly Latino family caregivers, related to another project, just to kind of humanize this problem or the challenge of balancing employment and caregiving. So if you look at this first quote here, we see a caregiver who says, "Sometimes I had to leave work when I was working. Right now I'm not working, but I had to leave work to take her to the doctor." And this is something we see a lot with family members. It might not be, oh, I need to go on an extended leave, but all the different things that you're required to do that have to get done between that 9 to 5 hours, or those 9 to 5 hours, can be overly disruptive to work. And so, that can add up over time. One second, Jennifer, is it okay? I see an iPhone enter the waiting room. Is it okay to admit them? All right, I'm going to go ahead and admit, excuse me. All right. And then we do see this other quote where a caregiver talks about another challenge that she's facing, which says, Yes, I actually had to take an early retirement, and she took a financial hit from this. She said I wasn't able to get my full pension. And so I think it's important to think about solutions to better balance employment and caregiving, knowing it can have a very real financial impact on caregivers long term, perhaps even compromising a person's retirement. Now, this is a chart that was from the National Alliance on Caregiving that they pulled together a few years ago, really comparing the effects of workplace impacts related to caregiving among caregivers to people living with dementia and those who are not living with dementia. Now, overall, you can see there are a wide variety of impacts, no matter what kind of caregiving you're providing, from having to leave the workplace early, having to take a leave of absence, retiring early, as we mentioned, even turning down a promotion. So something we don't always think about. But then if you look really at this comparison between caregivers to people living with dementia, so those are represented by those orange bars, compared to blue bars, so non-dementia caregivers, we do see a little bit of a stronger effect on these different workplace impacts. And we think this is probably related to the intensity of care that's provided by people who are caring for somebody living with dementia. So, balancing employment and caregiving affects all caregivers, but it can differentially affect certain groups of caregivers. It can be more challenging. I think the other piece of this, especially since I think our really big concern is this financial well-being aspect. Our financial well-being is not only comprised of what income we bring in, but also our expenses. And we know that caregiving is really, really expensive. So AARP did a report in 2016 and updated it just recently in 2021, where they found that caregivers are spending about $7,000 per year on the out-of-pocket cost of caregiving. So this can be things like covering the cost of medications, home modifications, durable medical equipment, even groceries. If you're caring first for a family member of, say, a parent who's living with you, most caregivers are not going to charge their parents separately for groceries. So that all gets kind of covered within the annual costs of caregiving. And I don't know about you, but I don't have a spare $7,000 to spend every year. So that's really challenging. Now, if you look even closer in at dementia family caregivers, that out-of-pocket cost per year is closer to about $10,000 or $11,000. So no small thing. The other piece of it too is, what is the proportion to income, right? So again, what are you bringing in and what do you need to be spending? And now on average, caregivers spend about 26% or 1/4 of their annual income on these out-of-pocket costs of caregiving. If we split that up by race and ethnicity, we see there's a lot of differences. So again, so 1/4 of a person's income is going towards caregiving expenses, out-of-pocket caregiving expenses per year. But let's say if you look at Latino family caregivers, that's closer to about 50%. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is really driven by values in the Latino community, where it's more important among these families in general. Of course, we're talking about the average family, right? There's going to be differences within families of any race or ethnic group. But we see that there's a preference to be the one providing direct care. And so this can make it more challenging to balance employment and caregiving, so that you're bringing in a lower income, you still have these expenses, which makes it proportionally much more impactful on Latino families. So before I go into our next part, which is these policies and practices to support family caregivers, I do want to pause and see if there are any questions or comments, personal anecdotes. We welcome all. I'm wondering too, I don't know, I know sometimes people will listen to these like a podcast, but if you are available, if you want to type in the chat, have you ever balanced employment or caregiving and caregiving, excuse me, or are you currently balancing employment and caregiving? We can get to know each other a little bit. Give a minute to type in your response. And this could be caring for an older adult, somebody who's living with dementia, perhaps a child or a sibling, lots of different relationships. All right, quiet group. I understand. It's fine. It's after lunchtime. I get it too. Okay, Daria. Yeah, absolutely. Currently balancing both children and parents. Absolutely. That sandwich generation. So stuck between, I don't want to say stuck, but you are between two different groups who may need some care and assistance. Daria, do you want to share a little bit more?
myself. Which aspect would you like me to share about?
What's it like to balance employment and caregiving? What kind of challenges have you faced?
It's challenging. It is. I have two parents that are nearing 80 years old that I take care of, and then I also have a 5-year-old son. And so I'm having to balance when to get my son to preschool because he's not in school yet, when to get my parents to their doctor's appointments, how to help them around the house, assist. My dad's had some medical issues, so we've been in and out of the hospitals. And I'm really the only driver in the family for long distances, like coming from the country into the city. And so between that and coming in to have to work, and I do work 2 jobs, so having to balance all of that is very difficult, especially being a single mom. So this is something that's really important, and I'm glad you're sharing about this because it's relevant.
Oh my gosh. Yes, absolutely. So that time constraint, the responsibility, I think it's really interesting. The point you bring about I'm the only driver. We know that's something that can be very prohibitive, especially when you're caring for somebody who might have a cognitive impairment and is no longer able to drive to an appointment, or maybe just there might be other reasons, vision impairments, other reasons why a person might not be able to go to those multiple appointments that are related to their the disability or condition that requires them to receive care. So absolutely, that's a great example. And I see in the chat too, Ms. Jones says, my husband has early dementia. I'm trying to balance work and take off for his appointment. So those appointments are really, really tough. And we know sometimes it looks like there are solutions on papers. Oh, the Area Agency on Aging has this transportation service, or you could call a Lyft. And we know it's going to depend family by family what solutions are going to work. Some folks are not comfortable with a Lyft or ordering those the driving services. Some of the shared transportation services are not necessarily equipped for people who are living with dementia, who might not understand, hey, I need to get from point A to point B. Why are we dropping off all these other people? That's an example that we heard from one of our families who actually had a financial impact with were not able to use that service and ended up having to purchase a new vehicle because their own vehicles were not able to accommodate the wheelchairs and other equipment that their parents needed to get to their different appointments. Absolutely. I see Ms. Humble says, I'm disabled and also caring for my mom with dementia. You have a tiny Etsy business and live with my mom and stepfather. That's a really good point. And I think that brings up a very different side that is really important and underrepresented is the gig economy when you are self-employed. Gina, do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. I live with my mom and stepfather. I'm disabled, and I actually moved in with them because I needed support about 10 years ago, but things have changed as my parents have aged. So, but in regards to the Etsy business, I think the thing that I'm wrestling with is it's slow to start. It's starting a business, it takes time. And so the financial rewards aren't there yet, but I see all the potential. But whether or not, those financial rewards can come in enough time for me to be able to kind of wait it out. I think that's a challenge I'm facing.
That's such a good point. So I think, and sometimes I'm sure it might be, or don't let me project, but it's probably challenging. Some people might go, oh, that's great. You have all this flexibility because you're not working for an employer who tells you your hours, but starting a business is no joke. I mean, you're pouring in tons of time, I'm sure.
Yes, it is a lot more than you would think, but it's fun. I will say that. I love it. I mean, I'm hoping I can make it work. We'll see.
It's amazing. Well, congratulations. We wish you the best on it.
Thank you.
Well, I think with that, I'll dive into our next section here. So what are some different policies and practices that are available to support family caregivers to balance employment and caregiving? And I do want to mention that I know I was talking to Jennifer about this before. We did advertise this event to a lot of our UT Health colleagues. And so I want to mention I am not a UT Health HR expert. And so I can't go into all the nitty-gritty details about the specific policies at UT Health. That's above my pay grade. But I want to go into some of the state level and kind of federal level policies, and do point you to HR. And we'll talk about why that's so important to start those conversations as well. So the first one I want to talk about, and many of you are going to be familiar with this policy, although maybe not all of the ins and outs, because oftentimes we learn about these policies before we're a caregiver, and it's sometimes it takes some time to remember, wait a minute, that applies to me. So it's good to refresh here a little bit, but this is the Family Medical Leave Act, or FMLA. It was passed in 1993. It is a federal law, so it's not going to vary state by state. However, some states will have some additional protections. So we'll talk about what that means. So with FMLA, people who are caring for a loved one, an immediate family member, can receive up to 12 weeks of leave from work. And so this is important to note, unpaid leave. So it provides job protections to maintain your position and to cover health insurance if you have that, but you aren't necessarily going to be paid. So this can be a challenge for families, since we know that some people may really, really need this leave, and yet may not be able to afford to take this leave. And so this is relevant for different kinds of caregiving. So it could be caring for somebody living with dementia or a chronic or disabling condition related to aging, or we know too, this is related to parental leave that somebody might take, such as when they have a child. Sorry. So many different points I want to make, I'm losing track. One thing to note is FMLA can be taken in different ways. And so some people might take that full 12 weeks, and that's provided per year. So it would renew at a new year. But you might split this up or take an intermittent leave too. So you'd want to be working with your employer about what that would look like. Now, I did mention that FMLA is going to vary state to state. Some states have extended protections primarily related to the different relationships that are covered. So like in California, for example, FMLA would cover caregiving for a grandparent, for example, and different kinds of family considerations. Since we know what it means to be a family member might mean something different for different individuals. So that varies by state. Now, a couple of points to be aware of. There's a couple other considerations, not just can you afford to take this leave, but other aspects of eligibility. So you have to have worked with your employer for at least 6 months, or provided, in addition, you also have to have provided over 1,250 hours to that employer. There are also some geographic constraints, which brings up some really interesting situations with our current remote work situation that haven't been totally resolved. There is just recently an article in Inc. magazine you might want to check out on this, but you have to work at a location where your employer has at least 50 employees within a 75-mile radius. So I think there will probably be some interesting implications of our increasingly remote work situation in the future. So as a result of all these kinds of limitations, only about 60% of US employees are currently covered by FMLA. Now, one more consideration, I just remembered my other point, excuse me for jumping around here, but I do want to mention with FMLA is, even though the Department of Labor at the federal level does not require you to provide a certification of why you're taking leave, your employer may. So you may need to, and your employer will encourage you to provide advance notice within a certain period. Oftentimes that might be a month or a month and a half. But we know that's not always how caregiving works. So if your loved one does have a hospitalization and suddenly you need to be there, that doesn't mean that you wouldn't qualify for FMLA. It does mean you need to start that conversation with your employer as soon as possible to make sure you have this access to this protection. Last thing I'm going to point out with FMLA is that even though it provides job protection, we know this is something that requires a little bit of flexibility and compromise with your employer, where your employer might not be able to preserve your exact position and what you're doing for 12 weeks while you're on leave. So your employer is required to provide protections where it would be an equivalent position. So because of different demands. So just to keep in mind, and that might not be protection for the very position that you're in, but at least an equivalent one. Now, the other piece of this is paid family leave. So there is no current federal paid leave law, although we talked about it a lot in 2021 and 2022 related to Joe Biden's Build Back Better legislation that was not passed yet. So as of May of 2022, today, there is no federal leave law or paid leave law. However, many states and individual employers do offer paid leave options. Typically, this is going to be, anywhere from a lot of times I will see 6 weeks of paid leave, although that could vary. It's based on the different employer. I think Amazon, just was advertising for like 20 weeks of paid leave or something like that. The amount of pay may or may not be equivalent to your wages when you're not taking leave. So you might receive a percentage or some proportion of your wage, depending on how your employer calculates this. Something that's important to note is that you may be eligible for paid leave with your employer. That does not necessarily mean that you're going to be eligible for job protection or FMLA. Oftentimes they're going to overlap, but not necessarily. So something to be aware of. Now, I do want to mention too, as an employee at UT Health San Antonio, I'm very proud to say that very recently, while the school was rearranging their leave policies and thinking about the needs of the employees, they did begin to offer a paid family leave program. So it's a point of pride for us, I think. I know I'm pulling out my policy wonk here. So I know sometimes that can be a little dry. Before we go into paid sick leave and unemployment insurance, I do want to stop and pause to see if there are any questions or comments about FMLA or paid family leave. Has anybody applied for FMLA ever? Or maybe even have you not considered it yet? And are you going, maybe this is something I should look at? Shy group, that's okay. Don't worry about it. Yeah, okay, Kayla. Absolutely. Looking into it in the future, wasn't eligible. Absolutely. And that can be so disappointing because if you, again, only 60% of workers are employed. Kayla, would you like to share more? Don't feel pressured. You don't have to.
Yeah, I remember like I had to work like a certain amount of hours. I had been with the company for those 12 months, but just my hours didn't rack up to what it was supposed to. I met like all the requirements except for that one.
Oh, how frustrating. So that 12, a little over 1,200 hours. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ms. Jones says, I have to work 2 more years to get my retirement. So yeah, so you'll apply. Absolutely. And this is, I think that's a good point to make too, is how can you use FMLA as a bridge to make sure that you reach where you can get full pension benefits or retirement benefits from your organization. So oftentimes we will see employees, and it's of necessity, kind of pulling together their different leave options, including FMLA, vacation time, in order to make this work. So it can be quite patchwork, and it requires probably a certain level of creativity that we don't necessarily want to tap into, but caregivers are very, very resourceful and do it every day. Excellent. So we'll go back here and now we'll talk a little bit more on this paid sick leave, which probably there's a little bit of variation here compared to the other leaves that we talked about. So paid sick leave, many times people will have an allotment as a part of their employment to receive sick leave. And oftentimes we're thinking about this for ourselves when we fall ill or when we need to go to a doctor's appointment. It's some companies and states and locales are increasingly recognizing that, hey, could we take what we have already for our sick leave policy and extend it to family members to help with caregiving? So again, not a federal law, lots of variation in whether this is offered. And I want to say too, it's something where I think people don't always think about this as a way to help manage the time demands of caregiving while working. I was just working with an organization here in San Antonio, and I'm going to brag on them a little bit, as the San Antonio Oasis, who provides education programs for older adults. We often are visiting there, doing community-based talks. And, we were meeting as a part of a larger initiative, the Successfully Living and Aging in San Antonio initiative. A lot of these organizations that are age-related and focused on caregiving issues in the city. And the executive director at the San Antonio Oasis, we were talking about balancing employment and caregiving. It goes, oh my gosh, we have a paid sick leave policy. we don't technically extend it to caregiving families. So you can use this leave time to care for your loved one. And so she made that change at her own organization. And then she brought it all the way up to the national organization of OASIS and created that change. So I just bring it up to say, sometimes employers, it's not that they don't want to offer this, it's just they haven't thought about it. So, it might be something that you consider raising with your employer in the future. Oh, sorry. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you don't know about all of these things. So it's always worth asking. And so caregivers are very good help seekers. So finding out information, Googling things. And so this is one more thing that you might do, and asking an employer to say, hey, is this available to me? Yeah, and Kayla asks, are these benefits only available for full-time or part-time? And that's really a question of, it depends. So it's going to depend employer to employer, where actually I should know this. So San Antonio, I believe, as a locale, does have a paid leave protection, although it's not at the state level. So I don't have the particulars of that. But it's something to look into, and I'll see if I can dig something up. And I'm sorry, I'm coming a little less prepared than I should be on that local information. But also check with your employer too. Even they may have a slightly different policy that may be more beneficial too. So it's something to think about. And then this is a benefit that we really don't oftentimes think about for caregiving, but could be something to look into, which is the unemployment insurance. And so I want to preface this with, it's going to work in a couple of cases, but not all, and probably has less breadth than even some of the other policies that we've talked about, where we already have some exclusions that we've mentioned. So caregivers whose employment is disrupted by caregiving may be eligible for unemployment in some states. Now, I was looking up the Texas laws in particular, and it's going to be somewhat narrow. You may be eligible if you are caring for a spouse who is terminally ill and you need to quit your job related to that personal reason. And that's not to say that you shouldn't apply. I think it's something that, see if you're eligible, because, one thing to consider too, with all of these different benefits, you can see how dynamic they are. Maybe you're not eligible today, but when you need it, or you need to look at reapplying in the future, you may be eligible. So just be persistent. One thing to keep in mind with unemployment insurance is you want to communicate with your employer first. So caregiving, we know, can be disruptive to a person's employment, where you might have to take lots of time off. You might be picking up the phone to call the doctor and make that appointment to check on a prescription, all these different things you might need to do during the workday. You don't want to get fired because of time away from work without notifying your employer, which could compromise, if you were eligible, your ability to attain unemployment insurance. So communicating with your employer is really important. And Kayla says, how would unemployment work? Because, I had to move my screen. How would unemployment work? Because I heard you need to be looking for a job. Yeah, and that gets where it does get into the particulars too, where you might need to quit your job because you're not able to do that job because of balancing work and caregiving, but you might be able to find another job that allows you to balance work and caregiving that might have different hours, for example. So it gets a little bit into the weeds. So I would say double check with your company and the unemployment insurance office, and keep checking. Definitely great questions. And I'm sorry, I know so much of this is the somewhat unsatisfying answer of it depends, right? So again, a couple of things you might also consider in addition to some of these potential protections is really comes from working with your employer. So you might think about doing things like negotiating a flex time policy. So, if you want to manage some of those appointments, I know some of us have brought up the challenge of trying to schedule appointments, how they take place during the workday. And so that can be disruptive. Maybe you talk to your employer and says, hey, I need every Wednesday morning as flex time. I'll work late during, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. Could we make this work? And I'll schedule my appointments at that time. So that could be one option you might think about. So subsidized respite care, there's different kinds of, and this is actually, I probably should have put this under a different label here, where different employers will offer different employee assistance programs where you might have access to, in addition to, Jennifer mentioned the Area Agency on Aging, or AACOG, different services you may be eligible for as a caregiver, because these are available to any caregiver in the city or in the state. Your employer might offer, and many employers are increasingly offer, supports for family caregivers. For example, we know many caregivers experience a lot of stress and are managing a lot of stress, are at a higher risk for depression. See if your employer might offer something such as counseling services or financial management to help you think about what do you need to protect your own financial well-being while you provide caregiving. Absolutely. Let's see. Now, one thing I do want to mention is, well, actually, I'm going to mention two things. One has a slide, one does not. One is just be aware that sometimes caregivers will perceive working remotely as a solution to help them better balance employment and caregiving. But we know that just because you're working remotely doesn't mean that your work isn't disruptive. So you still need and are present to provide care, which might be okay if all you need to be doing is monitoring. But if your loved one has high needs, might be wandering during the day, this might be untenable and create a potential for you feeling burnt out. We also know caregivers who are challenged with balancing work and caregiving can experience what's called presenteeism. And you can probably get from that term, it's related to absenteeism, but you're there. So you might technically be present at work, logged in, doing your job, but you aren't fully able to have that attentional focus that you need to do your job well, which can compromise your employment in some cases, or make it difficult to go for that promotion. It's going to look different in different situations. Something I wish I'd had a slide on, and I didn't think to add it before now, is family responsibility discrimination. One thing that I think is a bit disappointing about our current social political situation is we don't have any laws to protect family members who need to take time off to provide care from workplace discrimination separately. So, but there are, and AARP actually has a pamphlet on this, some protections that may extend because you are caregiving. So this could be because you could extend aspects of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or excuse me, I'm mixing up the legislation, but there may be avenues to seek recourse for family responsibility discrimination, but the laws are pretty iffy. So I just want to mention that too. And Gina says it can be super challenging with dementia because it really requires defining boundaries of their experience. Absolutely. And it's something where your family member might not always understand why you need to create those boundaries. And so that can be that much more challenging. You might think about too, how do you seek respite or help from other family members? And I know sometimes saying that is, sometimes you get this big eye roll, because we know oftentimes you go to ask for help for other family members and sometimes they come through. So sometimes that can work really well, but sometimes it's like, okay, it all falls on me. So I don't want to be Pollyanna here and say, oh, just ask for help, of course, but it might be something to look into. Now, our next piece is talking about deciding to exit the workforce and different considerations. But because that was a really fast sprint through policy, I wanted to stop and pause here again to see if there's any other questions or comments about these different job protections for between paid leave, family leave, sick leave, unemployment insurance, flex time, FRD. Has anybody ever experienced family responsibility discrimination? I know I maybe that's probably that I'm just meeting many of you, so maybe it's a personal question, but I will say I've been working on an initiative at the city where one of the things that this work group was talking about was sometimes we have policies that are on the books, but it doesn't always feel like we can bring these up because there's that stigma, there's that pressure to be the ideal worker, the person who shows up early, stays late, acts like, you know, their existence is revolving around their job. So there is that pressure sometimes, which makes it hard to say, I need to take leave or I need to ask for flex time. So sometimes it can be a challenge with company culture, and that might be a sign that, hey, maybe this isn't a good fit anymore. Or if you're comfortable with doing so, something that you might bring up with your employer to say, I feel a little uncomfortable here, but I know I don't want to, again, dismiss how difficult that could be too. All right, so I've been talking a lot. So what I want to do is actually introduce you to a couple of my friends here who are going to talk about balancing employment, or excuse me, deciding to exit the workforce. And before we watch this video, I want you to consider a couple of questions and just be thinking about it as you watch. So the first is, what kinds of considerations do Sonia and Mabel make when they're deciding whether or not to leave the workforce to provide care? And then the other part is, what makes financial decisions like leaving the workforce also personal decisions? Why is this kind of a dual decision? And I want to mention Sonia and Mabel are real caregivers. They are caregivers who attend our events. You might have seen them at our events. They might have signed up today. Although, as you'll learn, Sonia is actually a school teacher in the area and is balancing employment and caregiving right now. But I want you to hear about their challenges here. And I'll mention you should not be hearing any sound yet. You're not missing anything. Context.
I was teaching ESL for adults when my dad had a stroke, and that just changed everything in my life. I had to make decisions. So my husband and I, we talked about me giving my notice, because after my dad's stroke and my mom's Alzheimer's, it was a big, huge package for me to deal with. So he went on ahead and said, you know what, we can work this out. I give you my support 100%. Then after I had a routine, I thought, well, I'm going to go back to work. And I did for part-time. And when I did, oh my gosh, it was stressful. I was always worrying about my parents. It just couldn't happen. I couldn't juggle it. So finally, I walked away from it completely.
Well, I'm not at that point yet, but I work an hour away. And we had a scare recently. Mom called and said, your dad's not feeling well. He's lethargic. So I rush home, take him to the emergency room, and he gets admitted into the hospital. So I had to take 2 days off from work so that I could take care of Mom and Dad. And now I have some important decisions to make about the future.
Well, I can tell you this, if you do have to leave your job, you may experience what I did. And that was, I did not recognize my home. I had a hard time with the new routines of caring for both of my parents. And that was a real struggle. I missed my coworkers. I missed the work environment. I just missed all that was once part of my life. But you know, eventually you do adjust to a new routine, and you do find ways, and you can get creative in the caring of someone that needs that care.
But you know, I shouldn't even be saying this out loud, but sometimes I feel, what about my dreams? And I feel bad because these are the people that love me. But what do I do with the dreams that I've created?
Listen, sometimes in life we get derailed. And when you get derailed, you feel like you're lost, you have no direction. But I can assure you that new routines that you develop will come. Life will get better. Embrace it. Embrace those new routines. And remember, you will have the opportunity to spend more time with people that you love. Oh, you're welcome.
So I'm going to stop the share and just kind of open up the conversation, because that's kind of a tough video to watch. And I want to say we filmed this in December and we started with a script. Sonia and Mabel went off script. It was just a very heartfelt, very authentic conversation. But I want to stop and pause and see, can any of you relate to some of the challenges, that guilt sometimes, or what other aspects? Gina, what would you like to share?
Oh, I just when she said, "What about my dreams?" It just kind of stopped my heart. I feel that, and then there's the part about embracing the new routine, and that you get to have this time. And I think for me, having sort of working on having a gratitude lens has really helped me to be able to embrace the routine and see that this is a special time with my mom, and this isn't really what I pictured for this time in my life, but there's a lot of blessings. So that's what I feel on my good days. Of course, then there's the harder days when you realize that you have given up a lot. So I liked the video. It really resonated with me.
Absolutely. I think you bring up really good points, because that whole struggle of, I love my parents, and it's something that you do out of love so often, but yeah, what about me? And it's okay, I think, to feel, well, we sometimes, especially as women, I want to say, and I don't want to generalize too much, but sometimes it is, oh gosh, I'm selfish for wanting to, pursue these things that are going to disrupt care to somebody that I love. There is that dual identity. But yeah, that point about trying to reappraise the situation and say, it's not what I planned, but there can still be good from it, I think is a really good skill. I think I just learned a really good phrase. I don't know who I was on the call with, and probably was Jennifer, you might have been there, I can't remember, but grow with the flow. So we go with the flow, but sometimes it requires an aspect of growth from ourselves. Definitely. Anyone else want to share?
I think I can share here. I was trying to decide if I wanted to do it or not, if it'd make me cry. I wish I wouldn't have been so mad about the diagnosis for so long, because my mom had a terminal diagnosis of lung cancer that had spread to her brain. And if I had a short period of time, but I didn't know that. I couldn't see far ahead, right? So in retrospect now, I wish I would have grow with the flow, or I wish I would have done what Gina was just saying. I wish I would have been, and what they said in the video, I wish I would have just embraced it sooner, so that I could have enjoyed that time a little bit more. So there it is. I'm going to stop.
We've done this before, Jennifer. You're going to get me too. No, I think that's something, and it's so hard, and it's not at all to say be dismissive. I mean, this is hard, trying to let go a little bit and embrace a new reality. This is not at all to say, oh, just do that. Just do that. It's a big, big step. And I know something I would suggest too is, you're not on your own. A lot of people are going through this. So talk about it. I think there's a Rosalind Carter quote that says, there are 4 types of people in the world: those who are caregivers, those who have been caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who will need caregivers. So, and frankly, many of us are going to check multiple of those boxes. Let's be real here. So, talk about it. Thank you so much for sharing. Does anybody else want to share? That's okay. And we're going to leave some time at the end too, because I know woo, sometimes you don't want to drop this emotional bomb and then, okay, let's keep going. Well, we'll circle back too. All right, so a couple of things that you might consider to reflect, and these are just some prompts that you might journal about, you might think about before you're going to bed or when you're in the shower, whenever you do your best thinking, right? But when you're deciding whether or not to leave the workplace, again, you have the financials part, and that's real, because financial stress does have real health effects, we know. So, I don't mean to minimize this, but also the personal side of it, the social side of work. So think about, how will you receive health insurance if you need to leave work, since we know insurance is often tied to a person's employer. Can you afford the day-to-day expenses? What kind of money is put away? Yourself or potentially your loved one might have resources to help with their care. What will the effects be on your retirement security? And so we know that there is hopefully a growth in our retirement if you put in, $100 this year, in 10 or 15 years, because of that interest, it's going to grow. So not putting in now could have a long-term financial effect, especially for younger caregivers. We know that for older caregivers, you're probably that much more thinking about, okay, well, there's less time to recover, not being able to save, or having to spend down parts of your retirement. Will you miss your workplace? There's socialization pieces, there's self-actualization. Many of us consider work as a part of our identity. I know as a researcher, my work is not 9 to 5. It's very much a part of who I am. So, it's hard to think about, well, what would happen if I needed to step away a little bit? How would I seek fulfillment again? And that there are certainly ways. What's the cost of care? Of paid care. So sometimes it may be, in certain situations, more financially beneficial to leave the workplace and provide direct care, because we know that if you pay somebody to come into the home and provide direct care, that those costs add up. It's going to vary by who you go to, their level of expertise, where you are, but expect to pay about $25 per hour at least to receive in-home care, for your loved one to receive in-home care. Other options may be adult daycare, which can be a little bit less cost prohibitive. So something to consider. And then what opportunities do you have to return to the workforce? If you are in a technical field that moves very, very fast, you may find that if you need to take a year or two away from the workforce, it could be difficult to come back in. And unfortunately, we do live in a world that is not perfect, where, some people do have concerns about age discrimination. So I'm working a job, it's a steady job right now, but getting rehired into a job, if I take a step back, might be more challenging. And there are certain, as much as it's awful and we don't like to think about it, but that is an unfortunate reality of our society we have to contend with and hopefully fix, right? And something to consider too, as you think about this decision, is consider talking to a financial planner. And this can help you to examine your current financial situation. What do different scenarios look like? Talk about your goals to make sure that those things are prioritized. I want to retire at a certain time, or whatever else it might be. And then identify steps to meet this goal. I do want to mention too, some of the other benefits. We think about retirement oftentimes as a four-legged stool. We want more legs on our stool to support our retirement, because it's going to be more stable then, right? So you might look at different sources of your retirement income from different places. One of those places, one leg on that stool, is Social Security. And we know that over time, most people will accumulate Social Security based on their workplace performance. But I don't know if many people know that you can log into the Social Security Administration site and see how far along are you on accumulating credits, to know where you are in terms of when you can access those. Not that, so right now I'll confess, I was checking up on all my financials recently, and I was looking at my credits. I have 25 of my 45 or my 40 credits completed. Well, I'm 29 years old, so I got a long time before I'm eligible. So I think the eligibility for me is like 67, but it's probably going to go up by the time I reach there. But, you know, it's just something to think about as one more thing in the mix of your different resources to rely on for retirement. You might also have something through your workplace, a personal Roth IRA, other things too. And your financial manager can help you to look at different products you might want to consider that could help you address your financial situation in retirement and support financial well-being while you're caregiving or while you're thinking about other changes related to caregiving or other life transitions. Caregiving is just one type of life transition, right? Now, I'm going to actually kind of skip over. Actually, let me see. I'm going to look to the chat right now. I have a brief section on communicating with your employer about caregiving. Do we want to go into this? Is that going to be helpful? Actually, you know what, before we do that, and I think my awareness here is, okay, I see a thumbs up from Jennifer. Before I go into kind of my tip sheet, I actually wanted to solicit some ideas from the group to see, have you ever started a conversation with your employer or your colleagues about your caregiving responsibilities, and what was challenging about that, or what worked? What was like, oh my gosh, I thought it was going to be hard, and actually this conversation went really, really well. And what did go well? Any veterans here on having these kinds of conversations? Or you might know somebody. Is there somebody, maybe you have a partner or a sibling who's had to have one of these conversations with their employer? Don't feel pressured to speak, I promise. I get to teach graduate students and undergraduate students. So I think some of our caregivers don't realize I'm used to receiving a silent room. So, and I know this is very personal stuff, so don't feel pressured. But I'll go back to some of those tips and see if it brings up any ideas. So a couple of things that you might want to do is, well, first you have to identify what you need. So sometimes, you know, it's good to have the conversation, but it can be helpful to start the conversation with, what do you need help with from your employer to make it easier for you to balance work and caregiving. You might also share with them your strengths. So if you're making an ask for them, I need a little help with flex time, for example, it might help you to present what solutions you've already implemented on your own. Show that you're already working towards a solution. Make it clear that you're still able to perform job duties, or maybe suggest adjustment in duties that will make you more able to complete these. Because again, we don't want to risk that family responsibility discrimination. And again, one of those harsh realities, but we want to make sure that we're having these conversations in a savvy way. Ask about employee assistance programs. So you don't know what you don't know. There might be more support for you than you would realize. You do have, it is important to understand that not all employers are going to be able to accommodate all of your needs. So it might be a little bit of a negotiation with them, depending on what their needs are to get the job duties that you're currently doing completed. And then just try, be solutions oriented is always good advice in life, and when talking about caregiving, negotiating caregiving with your employer. So just some thoughts to reflect on. So our last bit is a little more interactive, and I think it's pretty fun. But we want to identify different kinds of transferable skills that you might have learned from caregiving that you could put on a CV. So one of the things we talked about earlier was that sometimes when you leave the workforce, it can be kind of intimidating to think about, well, how am I going to re-enter? I mean, I've been caregiving. And I don't have anything else on my resume. It's, I have this gap, as we sometimes call it. So one way to think about this is, how do you flip the conversation? How do you say, I was a caregiver, I learned all of these skills, and it's a benefit to you. So I wanted to share a little bit more about this. So just to think about, as an example, the task of making dinner. And, we sometimes, we do this every day, right? We do it for ourselves, we do it for a loved one, but there are a couple of different skills here. You might have scheduling involved. So say, for example, your loved one is experiencing sundowners. So you have to accommodate that need. You're planning a menu, especially for somebody who might have special dietary needs. You might have to take into consideration, such as if they're having challenges with swallowing. So taking into account that kind of additional medical knowledge that you're receiving. Assisting with eating. So that patience that comes with potentially, depending on the level of support, helping somebody to use utensils and things like that. So this is an example from our doctoral student, Shanae, who shared, well, this is a task that requires time management, planning, organization, sanitation standards. You can tell she's a nurse by training, so sanitation standards are important for her field. That could be a transferable skill from caregiving, and assistance with ADLs. So it's just some different skills to think about. When I see one comment, oh yeah, thank you so much, Gina. So I was hoping we could kind of fill this in a little bit together and think about, rather than actually this table probably is a little bit too involved, but I was wondering if we could open up the conversation. And I want to preface this with brag. Sometimes we feel like we have to be humble. Brag. What is something you've learned in caregiving that's a skill you might not have had before caregiving, or one that's gotten even stronger, that you might say, you know what, an employer should be really grateful to have me and have this skill set with them?
I'll go really quick. So I think just even one of the things I share in regards to my story with my mom is advocating for myself. So if you want to transfer that to jobs, you can say it can advocate for the program or advocate for whatever it is that that job entails, and trusting yourself. So being assured of how you're responding, what you're doing. I learned that because even with my background and aging, and I didn't advocate well enough, and I didn't, even though I knew, I let my fear, or, well, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm not right, maybe they know better, get in the way when I should have said something sooner. So I think that's a transferable skill, I'd say. We could fluff it up on a resume too.
I love it. Oh my God, Jennifer, I don't even think advocacy is on. I have a kind of a list of transferable skills that people might use from our workbook, but ooh, we have to add that one because that's such a hard skill. That's great. Gina, what have you learned?
I was just thinking about resource development, like or accessing resources like this right now. It's kind of social work. My background's social work, so yeah. So I can't think of like the summary term. What's the term that I'm looking for? It's resource development. I don't know.
Yeah, resource navigation, finding, yeah.
Yeah.
And like we were saying before, oh my gosh, caregivers are so good at finding information. So typically when I go to sessions like this, I'm learning things. I'm like, oh my God, like I went to one session, I felt it was so embarrassing. I have to confess, I was teaching over at Oasis, and I had a caregiver who was very familiar from recent experiences with the veteran system. And if any of you have experience working with VA benefits, it can be a little complicated to apply for benefits, and the eligibility is changing, which is good because it's expanding, right? But you have to be pretty savvy with keeping up with some of this stuff. And so, honestly, I think I should have just turned off my mic and handed it to her. She was teaching the class. So caregivers are really good at finding that kind of information that might be important for a position like a social worker, for example. Certainly, if you're caregiving, many of the complex care tasks that are being done or that you may need to do could relate to nursing, could relate to being a CNA, lots of different things. And I think different kinds of positions. So if you kind of take a step back and think about the time management, the organizational skills. So there's some of those direct things that you're doing as a caregiver, the resource finding, the assisting with some of the medical tasks, but also, this, I think it applies across different kinds of jobs. It might be executive jobs, it might be teaching. There's lots of ways that you can be creative about this. Anyone else want to share what they've learned from caregiving that could apply to other positions? Being more patient, for example. I know if you're caring for somebody living with dementia, you might have to have this extra level of empathy that others might not understand. Maybe that helps you in a customer service job to be able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes.
I think something that, oh, kitty. Oops, am I on mute? Something that goes with that would be just communication skills. I love black cats. I have 7. Those are the other people that I care for, my kitties. Yeah, just like communication skills. I'm trying to think if there's a more specific. It's like, it's a certain kind of communication. It's, well, like you said, empathy. I think kind of going back into the social work box again.
Absolutely. And how many of us, I mean, I think every single job would benefit from having more empathy, from being more understanding, to be able to negotiate, right? Part of negotiation skills are being able to understand somebody else's position. So certainly that's transferable. And I see Joy says patience, definitely patience. This is interesting, all about tax deductions. So we need to, so when we're working on our tax filing, we need to remember, go to Joy. So tax deductions you can look for with your mother to when you help her do her taxes. That's really interesting. And I think something, I'm so glad you said that, because especially, and this is something I was seeing a lot when talking to spousal family caregivers, you know, typically, not always, and it's going to vary couple to couple, like sometimes one spouse will take over the finances, the other person is like, glad that you're going to do it, good luck with that. But if that other spouse gets dementia, it's like, okay, I'm learning this now. Joy, do you want to tell us a little bit more about your experience?
Sure, yeah. When I was first doing my mother's taxes, I just started caregiving for her about a year ago. At first it said she was going to owe like $14,000, and I was like, what? After I did all of the detective work of finding every single thing I could about all the extra expenses like transportation, prescriptions, all of her co-pays, I got it down significantly. And I was just like, oh my goodness, because that was really freaking me out. So I mean, all those little things, even today having to arrange transport for her. We actually used a cab today for a wheelchair, and you know, it was $100. And I was like, I'm keeping all these, I'm filing all these, you know, after this whole experience that I just did, you know, a month ago for the taxes. So every little thing counts, glasses, like any little thing, add it all up.
That's incredible, $14,000 in tax deductions. So do you have a future as a CPA?
I mean, maybe. I want to start my own business too. So I'm like, the wheels are turning about all these things that could go forward for my own business, you know?
Oh
Definitely.
yeah, absolutely. Well, and I
Yeah.
think the other skill we haven't touched on it yet, you raised, was this coordination. So, you know, a lot of times there are all these different services that you might be relying on, as well as informal support from others. Oftentimes there's a primary caregiver who's going, okay, you're going to be here at this time, and we're going to make sure that this appointment is made. All of that executive functioning that you're doing to manage these situations, that's a skill, and that's something that people do. Think about discharge planners, all the coordination they're doing to help, you know, piece together services when somebody's discharged from the hospital, for example. And again, I'm sorry, Gina, I'm like you, I have that social work brain where I think in that direction too. Anyone else want to share their experiences? Thank you so much, Joy and Gina and Jennifer, for sharing. Joy, Gina, Jennifer, wow, we couldn't have planned that better. Well, that is actually about all I have today, but I do want to share with you one more thing and then open it up to conversation. Well, 2 more things. Don't want to make a liar of myself. So a couple of key takeaways that we might want to share are, just remember that employed caregivers often have to balance work and caregiving, and it can be really challenging. It can be helpful to communicate with your employer about your caregiving duties in order to access benefits that you may need in the future or may need now, as well as to see if there's solutions you could work on together or additional programs you may not be aware of. When deciding to leave the workforce, just remember that it can be positive and it can be challenging. So not to mitigate that it can be challenging, but, grow with the flow as we said, and remember that you are building strengths as a caregiver. And I'll go on a brief tangent. And this is very much coming inspired from one of my colleagues I'm working with in the community who, I think something that we have a challenge with in our society is this is not a rant against capitalism, but there are aspects of how we think about how we use our time that can be counterproductive, where, I think we think about being employed in the workplace as being productive work. And if you're caregiving, oh, I'm not engaged in that productive work. And that can be kind of damaging to our own sense of self-worth and confidence. And I think we need to do ourselves a favor and say, listen, I'm doing critical work. I am doing this. This is highly skilled work. This is not taking a step back from, being in the productive labor force. This is doing something different that is essential. We know that caregivers provide $470 billion worth of care per year. If you were not providing that care, and if you take it from a policy standpoint, our current long-term care system in the United States is the Medicaid program, where a person needs to spend down their assets before becoming eligible for Medicaid, which can cover home and community-based care, which can cover nursing home care in some situations. And you can hear more about that at the next month's Essentials of Caregiving, Legal and Financial Planning. But imagine a world without caregivers. Oh my gosh, our long-term care system, our Medicaid system would be going bonkers. So just remember, what you are providing is skilled, it is important, it is critical to the community, and you are doing a service. So you better be darn proud of that. Now, I do want to mention just one more thing. Like I said earlier in this conversation, we are offering the Confidence Financial Education Program. This is a program that it's five parts, excuse me. It occurs over 5 weeks. All sessions are delivered by Zoom. We are currently gearing this program for Latino and Hispanic family caregivers. If you remember that statistic that we showed at early in the slide, this is because the increased impact of the cost of caregiving on Latino families, and because this is a grant-funded program through the AARP Foundation. And so we want to make sure this is a program that could be useful and effective with Latino families, which is why we're starting there, but hope to expand out in the future. This is a program that's available right now. Our spots in our first week when we opened our first session filled up like that. I think within a week we had all 12 spots filled. This is a link to that. And actually, let me put it in the chat. And we do have a session beginning in June, and we'll be offering it approximately monthly through June of 2023. So keep an eye out. If you know somebody who would benefit from this, please come join us. There is an option to participate in a research study. You don't have to, but if you're willing to fill out a couple of surveys, it could really help us to better understand if this program is working the way that we hope it will. So developing that evidence base. So I'm going to stop here. We have about 15 minutes.